there is A and B. So then comes the question, अगर मुझे RCM में कुछ जमा करना है और मैं RCM में जमा नहीं किया under 73 or 74 as the case may be, can officer levy penalty under 122?
Yes.
Yes. One understanding, officer ने बोला yes.
So today CA Anvesh Shetty will be taking the session. Welcome Anvesh, and the topic is the how to interpret taxation statute. Over to Anvesh.
Good morning again, all of you. And today's session, we will make a small attempt or a minor attempt to understand the taxing statutes. And I will restrict my discussion only to a couple of topics. Because as a student of law, when I used to attend initial classes on interpretation of statutes, 90% of the things would go above the head because the entire session was more into theory and there was very little of exercise for us to actually understand what was happening. So in today's session, I want to bring in couple of examples, couple of exercises in which as a part of our regular practice, we will all discuss, we will all start thinking as to how do we go about interpreting. But before we jump into those examples or exercises, the question is why interpretation? Now, if I am just a practitioner who is just filing the GST returns and I'm not getting into any litigation at all, then in that situation, do I even require interpretation? If that would be the question. And I always ask or tell myself this, before we play the game, we need to understand the rules of the game. And I believe that all the ones who are here, you might have played cricket. So in cricket, there are, in some matches, the rules will be that of an international game. And but we'll also play gully cricket. So the rule for an international game is entirely different from that of a gully cricket. So in an international cricket, what may sometimes become a sixer, in a gully cricket, if you hit to somebody else's compound, they will say you are out. Or in international cricket, you have the benefit of third umpire, side umpire, main umpire. But in gully cricket, there is no umpire and the person with the bat is the ultimate decision maker. So if he says out, it is out. If he says it is not out, it is not out. So the fun in playing the game is only when you understand the rules of the game. So in today's session, we will be trying to understand two such rules of the game. And vis-a-vis, we will also read one of the latest judgment by the Supreme Court in the case of Rajiv Bansal. But that judgment was in relation to income tax. But though the judgment was in relation to income tax, they have expounded certain way in which you are supposed to read the law. Okay. But if I were to directly take you, what does that judgment say? Then it may not convey the right idea. So I will first start with a couple of examples. I want all of you to participate as much as possible. And then we will go to the judgment. Now, the question number one would be, if I were to simply write that all staffs, contractors and vendors working on site must undergo training. Now, please pardon my bad handwriting. Yes. So now, if my sentence says this, that all staffs, contractors and vendors working on site must undergo training. Now, if this sentence is given to you, how are you going to read this particular sentence? Now, there are two ways of interpretation that is possible. One way of interpretation is that all the staffs, all the contractors, and only those vendors who are working on site must undergo training. Or only those staffs, contractors, and vendors who are working on site must undergo training. Or I'll give one more simple example, then I'll come back to this. But this question let us keep. Now, if I were to say that all boys and girls with long hair must go to principal's cabin. Now, how do we read this? Are we going to read it as all boys, whether they have long hair or short hair, and only girls with long hair must go to principal's cabin? So, two interpretation, all boys plus girls only with long hair, or boys and girls with the long hair. So this long hair, does it apply to only girls or whether it applies to both boys and girls? I want discussion to happen. Yes.
For both.
Both. Yes. So Arvindji is told both. It applies to this, that is this one, no sir. That is boys with long hair and girls with long hair should go to principal's cabin.
Correct.
Yes. Anybody else with the other thought process?
किसी को कोई जवाब देना है कि मुझे भी लगता है
अरविंद सर जो बोल रहे वही है
Okay. So there is a rule of interpretation, something called as rule of last antecedent. Rule of last antecedent basically means that whenever there is a particular qualifier का मतलब a example में long hair was a qualifier. Now this qualifier only applies to the last term that was used. So if I am simply using the word that all boys and girls with long hair, now if I were to say that the term long hair is a qualifier, that qualifier is only applicable to the immediately previous term, that is only it is applicable to girls only. So the interpretation of rule of last antecedent, if we apply, and that is to be applied whenever the court reads the law, it applies RLA, then it says all boys. So this means with or without hair, without long hair, and only those girls with long hair must go to the principal. So this is how we are supposed to. Now similarly, if I come back here, when I say all staffs, contractors and vendors working on site, so here working on site is a qualifier. So this working on site is not applicable to staff or contractors. It is only applicable to vendors. So all staffs must go to training, all contractors must go to training, and only those vendors who are working on site must go to training. So if I am a vendor who is not working on site, I need not go. But if I am a staff who is not working on site, I still have to go, because rule of last antecedent is only applicable to vendors and not to staffs and contractors. Very clear on this?
Tell me one thing. Can you give any GST example on this?
Yes. I will come back to that, sir.
Okay.
Yes. So now comes a question as to when we're reading this, where is that, how it is applicable to that of a GST law. Now I will just show our section, so whether the Word document is visible, sir.
Yes.
Now, only for the purpose of example, now let us understand section 74. Now 74 talks about if we want to call something coming under section 74, the special ingredients must be attracted. What are those special ingredients? That is,
Fraud.
it must be either a fraud or willful misstatement or suppression of facts to evade payment of tax. Now comes the question, how do I read? Because it says fraud, yes, or willful misstatement or suppression of facts to evade tax. Now comes the question, now comes the question, अगर मैंने fraud किया है, तो that itself is with an intention. There cannot be a fraud without intention to evade payment of tax. So that is a separate class altogether. But then comes the question, willful misstatement. Now when I make a willful misstatement, is that willful misstatement should be with an intention to evade tax, or whether any willful misstatement is covered under 74?
Any willful misstatement, because the word is itself willful, na? Therefore the intent to evade tax is already there in willful misstatement.
Now willful, the question is what is will? Now in willful, will is not evade the tax. Will is basically the person is aware that कि वो झूठ बोल रहा है. So the idea when we differentiate, there are three ingredients. But what is the classic difference between fraud, willful misstatement and suppression? In fraud, there is a device that is used. Whenever we say device, we are not talking about a phone or something else. Device का मतलब I am actively doing something to defraud the government. For example, I am doing an invoice, और then मैं वो invoice को फाड़ के फेंक रहा हूँ, और I am replacing one invoice with another invoice. So there is active involvement in doing something. There is a paper that I am creating. That becomes fraud. Whereas willful misstatement basically means, the difference between willful misstatement and suppression is keeping quiet, whereas willful misstatement is a lie. At best it is a lie. So lie becomes a lie when I know that it is a lie. So willful misstatement means it is a misstatement that I have told something wrong. Sometimes I often get WhatsApp messages where they say that UNESCO has declared Indian national anthem as the best national anthem in the world. Now, if I just forward it to somebody else, it is a misstatement, because I am making something which is not true. But when I forward it, most of the times I receive it in a family group, the people who are forwarding it don't know. So it is mere misstatement, not willful mistake. However, if where I know that this particular commodity should attract higher rate of tax, or when I particularly know whatever I am supplying is a different item altogether, and there I willfully misstate it, then it becomes wrong. But now the question is not that. The question is whether any willful misstatement will attract 74 or only those willful misstatement that is used to evade payment of tax. Because evade tax is a qualifier. Now, evade tax, if it is a qualifier, is it only applicable to suppression of facts or is it also applicable to willful misstatement?
Anvesh, the example which you have given,
Yes.
come to that example, that is staff, vendors.
Yes, I will do that.
Show
So
me that
here,
example again.
now,
No, Anvesh, show me that example
yes, one
again.
second,
Okay, okay.
because I'm dealing in, yes,
Yes. Now, if you see all staffs, after staff you have put the comma.
yes,
Okay. After staff, this is comma. Therefore, all staff must undergo training. Contractors and vendors working on site must. Suppose this there is no comma after staff. Then what will be the interpretation?
yes, I'll come to that, sir. I'll come to
Okay.
that. Now,
Similarly, here also, all boys and girls, there is no
commas.
comma. Therefore, the interpretation will be both boys and girls having long hair should. And go for 74. Again, after fraud, there is comma.
Yes, correct. You're coming there, sir. So here in 74, they are creating classes. Now, they say the word fraud. Right after the word fraud, they have put one comma. That means the fraud itself is one class.
Correct.
So whether there is evasion or no evasion, it makes no difference. This is one class.
Correct.
Then it is followed with fraud, comma, willful misstatement or. Now between willful misstatement and or there is no comma.
Correct.
So willful misstatement or suppression of facts to evade tax. Yes. So because there is only one comma, that is fraud. Ideally, when we say rule of last antecedent, when we apply, the general rule would be saying that if evade tax is a qualifier, it should only apply to suppression of facts. That is a general rule. But because there is no comma that is put after willful misstatement, this whatever I'm putting in yellow, no, yellow is not visible. I put it in blue. Now, this blue color, whatever I have marked, that is comma. That comma is not there. If that comma was there, then evade tax is only applicable to suppression of facts.
Correct. ठीक है.
But because that is not there, this becomes a separate class. This becomes a second class, that is willful misstatement and suppression of facts. This is the second class. So that qualifier must apply to both. So department cannot only say you have willfully misstated. They should also prove that you have misstated because of which there is tax evasion. So that is how it works. Now, how does that comma also functions? So there is something called as in taxes, taxing statutes, there is something called as Oxford comma.
अच्छा, ये क्या है?
Now, Oxford comma is not something, it is found by grammar Nazis. वो बोलते हैं कि ये grammatically ठीक नहीं बैठता है. You are not supposed to put it this way. But for a taxing statute, for them to make it understandable, they use this Oxford comma. For example, if I were to say, property must be divided between A, comma, B and C. Now the question is, if there is one property, are you going to divide it into two parts? And you will say, this will go to A and this will be going to B and C. Or are you going to read it as we are going to divide the property into three parts and say A, B and C? How are we going to read this?
Second, 1/3 each.
1/3 each. Okay. Yes. Anybody else?
चाहिए?
Equally.
सबके बीच equally.
Yeah.
One and B and C, two part.
Two parts. Yes. So this is how the interpretation becomes interesting, because it's the same sentence and one is reading in one way, another is reading another way. So that is where they use this Oxford comma, because if our intention was to say that let us divide the property into three pieces, then we have to create three classes. But just by putting one comma, we are only creating two classes, because and is not creating a separate class. It is reading B and C as one class. So this is where we use after B. If we put one comma, A, comma, B, comma, and C, grammatically this is not correct, because they will say that the moment you say and, you can't put comma and then say and again. But this is statutorily they say this is for Oxford comma. That means the only when they put B, comma, and C, then we have to think it is three parts. If there is no comma after B, there is no comma between and, then it is only for two parts.
Any example in GST?
I will take you through the example, sir. I'll come back to that probably at the end.
Okay.
Okay, on Oxford commas. That is also the one what we were talking about. This is also a classic example of absence of Oxford comma.
अच्छा.
तो क्योंकि willful misstatement अगर उन लोगों को 3 क्लास बनाना था, then they ought to have written fraud, willful misstatement, and 1 comma they were supposed to put. Then or suppression of acts to evade tax. Because they have not put that comma after willful misstatement or suppression becomes the same class.
Correct.
So or and does not actually subdivide. It actually groups words into one different class altogether. And anybody till now what we have discussed? Any questions?
किसी को कुछ कहना है? Okay. Yes, Anuvish, carry on.
Yes. Now that we have understood rule of last antecedent, now also that we have understood Oxford comma क्या होता है और उसे कैसे पढ़ते हैं, let us go into the next one. That is now why are we actually reading this? Now this is because this is something called as grammatical interpretation. We use the rule of the grammar. We use certain punctuations to understand, to derive the meaning of what that sentence is. So ideally, grammatical interpretation is a part of literal interpretation. Now, literally जो लिखा क्या गया है उसको हम पढ़ेंगे and we will try to arrive a meaning out of this. That is literal interpretation. Now, till very recent past, I, as a student of law, I would understand that literal interpretation and strict interpretation were both one and the same. That is what I used to understand. But now, in the Rajiv Bansal case, Supreme Court categorically on record have differentiated that literal interpretation is different from that of a strict interpretation. Now, in today's session, we will be talking about what are those differences and how the judgment is going to impact our GST reading in upcoming future. So, if I were to just take you through para 33 of the judgment, I will go very slow because our attempt is not to just finish off the judgment, but to take one or two essence from the whole of the judgment. So here they say, principles of strict interpretation and workability. The dominant purpose in interpreting a taxing statute is to ascertain the intention of legislature to impose a charge. Whenever you're interpreting the law, you need to understand the dominant intention, that whether they want to tax or whether they want to give exemption. Now, here they start talking about a literal rule of construction requires the language of the statute to be construed according to the literal and grammatical meaning. So whenever we are doing a literal interpretation, we are going to read it applying the rules of the grammar. Now sometimes when we apply the rules of that grammar, sometimes when we literally read it as it is, then the result may be ambiguous. The result may be something absolute rubbish. But even in that situation, we will read it like that only. So they say whatever the result may be, that is what literal interpretation is. Now to give an example in GST law as to how literal rule of construction works. Now let me take you to one, this is section 122, subsection 2. Now we must understand that in GST, we have section 9 that creates a levy of tax. There is section 50 that creates charge for interest. Section 47 that creates charge for late. There is section 122 that creates a charge or an imposition of penalty. So 122.1 covers around 21 cases. 122.2 is actually a mirror image of 73-74. Now, when you do 122.2, there is clause A and then there is clause B. We are not going to read A and B. That I believe that we have already covered in the past. What we are going to read is 122.2 covers any registered person. So first, how they are saying that who this section applies to, they say आप registered person होना जरूरी है आपको. That is the first thing. Not only registered person, आपको क्या करना है? It also says that who supplies. आपको supply करना है. For you to attract the penalty under 122 subsection 2, two condition. Condition number 1 is आपको registered person होना पड़ेगा. So if you are unregistered, 122.2 is not applicable. Second is, even if you are registered, what is the second condition that you need to fulfill? That you must supply. Only then 122 subsection 2 becomes applicable. But then the question comes is, मान के चलिएगा कि आपने लीगल सर्विसेज लिया है, उसके ऊपर आपने आरसीएम में टैक्स नहीं भरा, या आपने जीटीए सर्विसेज लिया है, आप उसके ऊपर आपने टैक्स नहीं भरा. So then comes the question whether penalty under 122(2) can be ever applied to you.
मतलब if I have received a legal services and I
Yes.
have not paid the tax,
Yes.
whether 122 penalty will be levied or not
Yes.
instead of 73 or 74.
Yes.
ओके, क्या लगता है आप लोग को?
Not leave it, sir.
मतलब अगर 73 74 हो या 122 हो तो किसमें मतलब अफसर कौन सा अप्लाई करेगा? 73 74 अप्लाई करेगा या 122 अप्लाई करेगा?
73 करेगा सर।
कारण क्या है 73 अप्लाई करने का?
74 होना चाहिए, सप्रेशन ऑफ एक्ट हो गया ना वहाँ पे।
नहीं चलिए, मतलब अच्छा चलिए 74 और 73 भूल जाते हैं, 122 में आ रहा है तो फ्रॉड तो
No, no, no. 122, sir, if I may just, 122(2) covers two situations, A and B.
Correct.
A is for 73. A जो है
A is for 73 and B is for 74.
74.
ठीक है, तो अभी चॉइस अगर दे कि 73 74 या 122 तो 73 74 करने का कारण क्या हो सकता?
Now, here, how I read the law, because I want to get into interpretation. So, I would not delve into the jump because उसमें ambiguity है. That is whether 74 can independently create penalty. Whether 74 is, that is the first question that we have, is whether 74 is dependent or 74 is independent. That is one of the question for the purpose of penalty. क्योंकि as far as levy of charge is concerned, that gets created under 9, no doubt. As far as interest is concerned, that gets levied under 50, no doubt. Then comes the question, as far as penalty is concerned, is 74 capable of levying the penalty independently, or is it written somewhere and 74 is just copying it? Because the power comes from somewhere. Because if I were to say that 74 or 73 independently खुद उसके पास वो power है, if I interpret it that way, then section 122(2) becomes odious, it becomes redundant, it becomes meaningless. क्योंकि इसका जरूरत ही नहीं पड़ेगा. जो भी ऑफिसर ने जो भी नोटिस इशू करेगा 73 74 के लिए, if he is invoking the power under 73 74 only, this particular section becomes redundant of 122 subsection 2. So without much discussing on whether 74 is independent or whether it is dependent, let us assume that it is dependent, only assumption, because that we will do it in a very different section altogether. Now if you are assuming that 74 is dependent on 122, अगर 122 में लिखा है पेनल्टी चार्ज कर सकते हो तो 74 में वो रिकवरी करेगा, वो नोटिस इशू करेगा. सो इफ विद दैट इन अंडरस्टैंडिंग 122(2) सेज आपको रजिस्टर्ड पर्सन होना चाहिए और आपको सप्लाई करना चाहिए, एंड वो सप्लाई के ऊपर अगर टैक्स भरा नहीं है तो देयर इज ए एंड बी. सो देन कम्स द क्वेश्चन, अगर मुझे आरसीएम में कुछ जमा करना है और मैं आरसीएम में जमा नहीं किया अंडर 73 और 74 एज द केस में बी, कैन ऑफिसर लेवी पेनल्टी अंडर 122?
यस
यस, वन अंडरस्टैंडिंग ऑफिसर ने बोला यस. एनी कोई और?
बक्से पे बोल रहा हूँ बस.
यस सर.
नहीं लगा सकता पेनल्टी सर. अगर अपना इंटरप्रिटेशन यही है ना सर तो नहीं लगा सकता.
नहीं लगा सकता. यस
जी सर.
सर नहीं लगा सकता.
नहीं लगा सकता. आप क्यों नहीं लगा सकता पुष्पेश जी, अगर आप कुछ ऐड कर पाएंगे?
सर क्योंकि अभी आपने जैसा बताया सर कि हु सप्लाइज, तो सर सप्लाइज तो उसने दी नहीं है, तो आरसीएम में भरना है.
So this is what a little interpretation means, कि हमें ये जानना जरूरी नहीं है कि द लॉ मेकर क्या चाहता है. लॉ मेकर जब ये लॉ फ्रेम किया तो उसका इंटेंशन हमेशा रहेगा कि हाँ फॉरवर्ड चार्ज हो, रिवर्स चार्ज हो, अगर आपने गलती किया है तो आपसे पेनल्टी लिया जाए. लेकिन व्हेन दे फ्रेम द लॉ, क्योंकि अगर जब आप 73 74 का लैंग्वेज देखते हो उधर वो सिंपली लिखता है पर्सन चार्जेबल विद टैक्स, लेकिन हियर दे आर नॉट यूजिंग द वर्ड पर्सन चार्जेबल विद टैक्स. Here they are using the word any registered person who supplies. Because they have used the word any registered person who supplies, and if I were to read it literally as it is, with the proper grammar, with what is actually written, then RCM penalty के ऊपर penalty कभी लगी नहीं सकता है under 122 subsection. अगर if the officer says no no मैं independently लगा दूं, that is a different litigation matter altogether. But if the officer, क्योंकि हम मेरे पास कुछ शोकॉज नोटिस आए हुए थे, ऑर्डर भी आए हुए थे, जिसमें ऑफिसर ने सिर्फ 122(2) को इन्वोक किया था और उसके ऊपर आरसीएम में टैक्स बोल दिया था. सो लिटरल इंटरप्रिटेशन हम जब करेंगे तो आरसीएम के ऊपर पेनल्टी नहीं आ पाएगा. केके सर, एनी व्यू ऑन दिस?
Yes sir. Document because I still think penalty
Yes.
can be. I will show you one good paragraph.
Yes.
बट क्या अपन इसका लिटरल इंटरप्रिटेशन सही कर रहे हैं? क्योंकि ये लिख रहा है हु सप्लाइज,
हाँ
ये सिर्फ ये नहीं बोल रहा कि हु इज सप्लाइंग, उस पर्टिकुलर केस के अंदर वो बात नहीं कर रहा कि हम वो केस स्पेसिफिक बात करेंगे। ही इज जनरली सप्लाइंग, जनरली अगर वो सप्लाई करता है तो अगर वो आरसीएम के अंदर भी कोई केस कवर कर रहा है तो वो भी यहाँ पे कवर हो जाएगा, ए रजिस्टर्ड पर्सन हु सप्लाइज।
Understood. So here,
मैं बताता हूँ।
what is marked in red, that becomes of primary importance.
नहीं, let me tell you.
Yes, sir.
Law should be read as holistic as it can be. You cannot read the law in isolation.
Yes.
A registered person who supplies. Now let me show you something. Then read, then understand. ये 93 आरसीएम का है। यहां लिखा हुआ है क्या है? Shall apply to such recipient as if he is the person liable for paying the tax in relation to the supply of such goods और सर्विसेज और बोथ। यानी कि अगर आरसीएम है तो रिसिपिएंट विल बी ट्रीटेड एज सप्लायर एज इफ ही इज लायबल टू पे। तो आप इस सेंटेंस को वहां पर इसको जोड़ेंगे नहीं तो आपका गलत इंटरप्रेट होगा। दिस हैज टू बी रेड विद दिस। यस,
Here, only thing to submit at this juncture would be, sir, the difference between 9(3) and 9(5. क्योंकि इन सेक्शन 9(3) में सप्लायर बदल नहीं रहा है, सप्लायर वही रहेगा जिसने सप्लाई किया है। It is what is getting shifted is only the liability to pay the tax gets shifted. I don't become the supplier. So अगर मैं सिर्फ लीगल सर्विसेज ले रहा हूं 5 लाख का, वो मेरा टर्नओवर में कभी नहीं आएगा क्योंकि आई एम नेवर अ सप्लायर ऑफ दैट।
एग्रीड, दैट इज
यस, दैट इज इन 9(3) सिर्फ लायबिलिटी शिफ्ट होता है, लेकिन 9(5) में द इंटरमीडिएट इटसेल्फ विल बिकम द सप्लायर।
ओके,
लेकिन आई कंकर विद व्हाट सर इज सेइंग because that is a part of our second discussion कि what is the difference between literal interpretation and strict interpretation। अगर हम कानून को literally पढ़े as the grammar it is, क्योंकि I don't know who, लेकिन किसी ने बताया कि any registered person who supplies वो generally बोल रहा है, वो forward charge भी हो सकता है, reverse charge भी हो सकता है। The literal interpretation what is marked in red, there they further classify and says who supplies any goods or services or both on which tax has not been paid. So now, it would have been much better if the lawmaker would have written the law instead of who supplies, if they would have written the word who receives. Because the word receive is not there, it is only they are talking about supply. And on supplies on which tax has not been paid. If they had written who receives on which tax has not been paid, then yes, correct. But this is how we literally interpret the law. लेकिन कोर्ट बोलता है कि you are not supposed to do literal interpretation. You are supposed to do something called a strict interpretation, because the moment you do literal interpretation, you are making the law unworkable. You are not reading the law holistically. You can't segregate a class, segregate a tax liability and say that penalty इसमें हम नहीं भरेंगे. That is what is precisely told in the judgment. So I will take you through this thing, what is told. Then we may open up for the discussion.
अन्वेष, इसमें दोबारा आना एक बार वो राजीव बंसल का केस जिसमें वो लिखा हुआ था स्ट्रिक्ट इंटरप्रिटेशन।
Take a minute. Yes. So here they say a literal rule of construction requires the language of the statute to be construed according to its literal and grammatical meaning, whatever the result may be. That is what literal rule of construction is. But then they say in para 33.
एक ऊपर मैं आपको अपना एक एक्सपीरियंस बताता हूँ। हम लोग जब किताब लिख रहे थे शुरुआत में, तो हम लोग कुछ चीजें को बोल्ड कर देते थे क्योंकि हमें लगता था वो इम्पोर्टेंट है, इसलिए बोल्ड कर देते थे। लेकिन हो सकता कोई और पढ़ रहा हो, उसको वो चीज इंपॉर्टेंट ना लगे, वो कुछ दूसरा चीज इंपॉर्टेंट लगे और वो उसको बोल्ड कर देता है।
Yes.
मुझे इस पूरे पैरा 33 में जो मोस्ट इंपॉर्टेंट वर्ड है जिसको हम लोग मिस कर रहे हैं, वो हम लोग पढ़ ही नहीं रहे हैं उसको। कौन सा वर्ड है? दैट इज द वर्ड इज डोमिनेंट पर्पस इन इंटरप्रेटिंग। ये जो वर्ड डोमिनेंट है, दैट इज वेरी इंपॉर्टेंट। द डोमिनेंट पर्पस इन इंटरप्रेटिंग अ टैक्सिंग स्टैट्यूट is to ascertain the intention of the legislature to impose a charge मतलब सेक्शन 9 का लेवाई या सेक्शन 50 का इंटरेस्ट, सेक्शन 47 का लेट फीस। तो वो बहुत इंपॉर्टेंट है। कहने का मतलब ये है कि आप कोई भी लॉ लेवाई के सेक्शन के अलावा बाकी जैसे 22, 23, 24 को इंटरप्रेट करते वक्त आप ऐसा इंटरप्रेट नहीं करेंगे कि लेवाई का सेक्शन ही खत्म हो जाए। अब मैं आपको याद दिलाता हूं 22, 23 and 24. 24 was I think overriding 22 and 23. लेकिन 24 में एक आरसीएम का भी था। तो हमने इंटरप्रेट ये किया था कि अगर 24 एप्लीकेबल हो गया है तब आपको रजिस्ट्रेशन मैंडेटरी है, इवन इफ यू फॉल इन सेक्शन 23।
Yes.
जैसे मैंने एक एग्जांपल लिया था, जैसे इलेक्ट्रिसिटी कंपनीज, उसका पूरा जीएसटी एग्जेम्प्ट है, एंटायर 100% एग्जेम्प्ट, लेकिन वो डायरेक्टर को फीस देती है, क्या उसको रजिस्ट्रेशन की रिक्वायरमेंट है या नहीं है? तो हमने कहा था कि अगर ये रजिस्ट्रेशन नहीं लेगा तो चार्जिंग सेक्शन 9 फेल हो जाएगा, इसलिए रजिस्ट्रेशन की रिक्वायरमेंट है।
Correct.
उसके बाद कुछ फाइनेंस एक्ट में अमेंडमेंट भी हुए, ये भी हुए। तो ये डोमिनेंट पर्पस इन इंटरप्रेटिंग, मतलब जब भी पूरा लॉ आप इंटरप्रेट करने की कोशिश करें तो कोशिश यही होनी चाहिए कि दैट लेवाई सेक्शन डज नॉट फेल।
I concur. I agree with you, sir.
एंड सेकेंडली कि व्हाई 122 इज देयर, 122 subsection 2 which is mirror image of 73 74, that Anmesh will tell. Yes.
Here, now, first they will say that the literal rule of construction, the dominant purpose. Now the very beautiful aspect of Rajiv Bansal's judgment is, normally whenever we read a judgment, there is lot of something called as obiter dicta. Obiter dicta का मतलब, if court gives a judgment in the last 4 to 5 paras, लेकिन उसके पहले जो 50 paras what they talk, the judges talk their mind out कि इसने ये बोला लेकिन वो ठीक नहीं है, ये ठीक नहीं है, and in the last 5 para they give the judgment. But in this particular judgment very specifically, there is very less of obiter dicta. हर स्टेटमेंट जो कोर्ट ने लिखा है वो किसी ना किसी जजमेंट का एक लाइन है. There is not even like very less than 5% of the sentence which the court has put from his own pocket, unless the last this thing. So when we were reading the book of नानी पालकीवाला, वो एक इनकम टैक्स का बुक आता था, कंगा एंड पालकीवाला, जिसमें every line that we would read, author had not written anything out of his own mind. जो नानी जी जो थे, the legend himself, सब एक सुप्रीम कोर्ट का एक लाइन और बोलते थे कि ए जजमेंट यू कैन गो एंड रीड इफ यू वांट टू अंडरस्टैंड व्हाट इज मोर टोल्ड इन दिस पर्टिकुलर थिंग, गो एंड रेफर दिस. सो ये पूरा का पूरा जजमेंट ऐसे लिखा है. So when they say the dominant purpose in interpreting a tax statute is to ascertain the intention of the legislature to impose a charge, then they say Banarasi Devi. So you are supposed to go back and read this judgment to understand in what context it is told. Then another para. A literal rule of construction requires the language of a statute to be construed according to its literal and grammatical meaning, whatever the result may be. तो रिजल्ट में भी करेक्ट, रिजल्ट में भी रॉन्ग, रिजल्ट में भी फेवरेबल, रिजल्ट में भी अनफेवरेबल. कहां लिखा हुआ है? पंजाब लैंड डेवलपमेंट. आपको उधर जाके पढ़ना पड़ेगा. नाउ then they differentiate. Now this is the most important part of this session, that is literal interpretation में result can be even, it can even fail the very purpose of the law in literal interpretation. They say you're not supposed to do that. In comparison, a strict interpretation, आपको क्या करना है? The कानून बोलता है आपको strict interpretation करना पड़ेगा. So strict interpretation of a statute does not encompass strict literalism. आपको वैसा ही नहीं पढ़ना है. There is no strict literalism. What you are supposed to do is, if that strict literal meaning, if is leading to absurdity or goes against the express legislative intent, then you are not supposed to do strict interpretation. Sorry, you are not supposed to do literal interpretation. आपको strict interpretation करना पड़ेगा.
ठीक है.
Okay. So the principle of strict interpretation requires the court to interpret and decipher the meaning of the word of the statute in their usual sense, not in their strict grammatical sense. Then further they say, taxing statutes are interpreted by following the principle of strict interpretation. Again, while interpreting a taxing statute, there is no room for any intendment. Now, this is also one of the interpretation where we say, if the lawmakers have specifically have written certain things, जैसे कि हमने सफर रिट्रीट जजमेंट में पढ़ा था कि out of 11 times the word 10 बार if they have written the word plant and machinery, एक बार if the lawmakers have written plant or machinery, and the senior counsel जिसने argument लिया था उसने बोला कि नहीं ये तो typographical error है. So the court said no, we will not read or as and, because we will not know your intendment. आपने और लिखा है, हम और पढ़ेंगे. So there is no intendment while interpreting the law. आपने जो लिखा है वो हम पढ़ेंगे, लेकिन अगर हम ऐसा पढ़ेंगे जो जैसा आपने लिखा है, and if that is leading to absurdity, if that is leading to nonsensical results, then हम उसे ऐसा नहीं पढ़ेंगे, हम strict interpretation करेंगे. We will somehow see to it that law becomes workable. Now, I would want to pose a query before the entire audience to say that, क्या GST में ऐसा parts है which is actually unworkable. So to give a very small example, sir, do I have 5 more minutes, sir?
Yeah.
Sir. For example, Rule 43 of CGST Act, जो ITC reversal के बारे में बोलता है as far as capital goods. But before jumping into Rule 43, because that is one of the most complicated pieces. Now, let us say that how do we compute interest? इन अ नॉर्मल पार्लेंस हमको प्रिंसिपल पता होना चाहिए, हमें टाइम पता होना चाहिए, हमें रेट पता होना चाहिए. ओनली देन we will get to know what is the interest. So rule 40, before going there, so if the law wants you to arrive at interest, so it has to tell how do you arrive at P, T and R. Principal क्या है, time क्या है, rate क्या है. Rule 43 में one blunder that they did. What is that blunder? For example, they removed the definition of what is P. Formula बोलता है PTR, but they have removed the definition of what is P. So now when you look into the law, it is impossible for you to arrive at how do you compute it. For example, then I want suggestion from the members as to how do you go about reading this. Whether my screen is visible,
Yes,
the
yes.
taxman wala.
Yes, yes.
So either reversal, I will not get into what 43 is, how the computation works, क्योंकि वो 1-2 घंटा लगेगा उसमें. The reversal का जो amount है, वो formula A से calculate होता है. This is the formula. TE का मतलब E divided by F into TR. तो हमें E का मतलब पता होना चाहिए, F का मतलब पता होना चाहिए और TR का मतलब पता होना चाहिए. But what happened is, previously the word E and F now also it is properly been defined, लेकिन TR word का जो definition था, it was written in clause F. एक clause F में TR का meaning था, but by way of an amendment, उन लोगों ने TR का meaning निकाल दिया. We don't know for what purpose they have done it. They removed the meaning of TR from 1/4/2020. So today, if I want to apply that formula E by F into TR, मुझे TR का meaning पता नहीं है, because कानून में वो निकाल they have amended and removed it. So now comes the question: in the absence of definition of what is TR, whether there is any reversal under 43 that is possible, or are we supposed to artificially read the removed TR as the present TR? Now, if we do so, then are we not ignoring the amendment that is brought in law? Because then that amendment becomes meaningless.
Okay.
Any inputs from members? हम इसे कैसे पढ़े?
पता नहीं, मुझे तो पढ़ना पड़ेगा ये जो बोल रहे हो. क्या बोल रहे हो?
So, without TR, is it really possible to enforce that formula?
पता नहीं, हमने अपने किताब में TR की जगह TM लिख दिया है.
TR is the aggregate of all the TMs. लेकिन when they write the formula as TR, can I? So this is the difference. अगर मैं उसे literally पढ़ूं, then it will fail. लेकिन मुझे मैं अगर strict interpret करूं, then it will somehow pass. So the question is, should I do a literal interpretation? Should I do a strict interpretation? अगर literal interpretation करूं तो nothing to reverse in 43. Even now you are doing 90% exempt supplies, आपको reverse करने की जरूरत ही नहीं है क्योंकि वो TR का definition remove हुआ है. The provision is unworkable. तो वो BC यूनिवर्सिटी जिसका रेफरेंस इसमें भी दिया हुआ है राजू बंसल जजमेंट में. सो BC यूनिवर्सिटी जजमेंट में भी वैसा ही हुआ था, wherein the law did not provide for proper machinery to arrive at the capital gain in the case of goodwill. कानून में ये बताया गया कि because for me to arrive at capital gain, two things are important. मुझे सेल कंसिडरेशन, I need sale consideration, I also need cost of acquisition. लेकिन cost of acquisition गुडविल इन व्हेन वो गुडविल होगा तो कॉस्ट ऑफ एक्विजिशन क्या होगा? सो लॉ ओनली सेड कॉस्ट ऑफ एक्विजिशन ऑफ गुडविल ऑफ बिजनेस इज जीरो. देन केम अ क्वेश्चन, ए बीसीसी यूनिवर्सिटी का जो था वो प्रोफेशन था. सो व्हेन द लॉ सेज कॉस्ट ऑफ एक्विजिशन ऑफ गुडविल ऑफ बिजनेस इज जीरो, कैन यू रीड इट एज कॉस्ट ऑफ एक्विजिशन ऑफ गुडविल ऑफ प्रोफेशन इज आल्सो जीरो? सो कोर्ट सेड नो, यू कांट रीड दैट वे. व्हेन द लॉ क्लियरली सेज इट इज फॉर बिजनेस, इट इज फॉर बिजनेस, यू कांट एक्सट्रापोलेट. देयर इज नो इंटेंडमेंट. अगर आपको लिखना है तो लिखे, आप ऐसा मत कीजिए कि कोर्ट को सब इट हैज टू ऐड वर्ड्स दैट इज नॉट रिटन. सो बीसीसी यूनिवर्सिटी वाज गिवन इन फेवर ऑफ द टैक्सपेयर, बट that was at that point of time. But the judgments what we are seeing in the recent past, in the last 2-3 years, more specifically this year, all the judgments they are doing strict interpretations. Nobody is doing little interpretation. So revenue is losing very little cases. They are somehow making the law workable and sending back matters for fresh consideration. So this is a thought for all the members कि आज के, because it is coming 8:30, after today's session आप rule 43 को पढ़िए और in the absence of TR का meaning आप उसे कैसे इंटरप्रेट करेंगे. अगर आप ऐसे इंटरप्रेट करेंगे रिवर्सल जरूरी नहीं है तो वो क्या करेक्ट इंटरप्रिटेशन है इन लाइट ऑफ डिफरेंस बिटवीन लिटिल इंटरप्रिटेशन एंड स्ट्रिक्ट इंटरप्रिटेशन. दैट वाज माय सेशन. थैंक यू सो मच सर फॉर दिस अपॉर्चुनिटी एंड इट वाज लवली एक्सपीरियंस टू डिस्कस विद द एंटायर टीम.
Thank you, Anvesh. Thank you so much. And your session was very, very good. It was excellent. Superlatives I can say, and let us take the opinion of all the members and let us say what they are saying. Yes, please बताइए कैसा रहा अन्वेष का
Sir,
session?
it is a great session, sir. Actually, what I thought that I could understand, I will be understand nothing from Mr. Sethi, sir.
Okay.
But it is really very nice, sir, because I have no idea about law, but today I learned all these things very clearly. Thank you,
Okay.
sir.
चलिए और कौन कहे?
बक्सेटी बोल रहा हूँ।
हाँ बक्सेटी जी बोलिए।
हाँ सर, एकदम बहुत बढ़िया था। सीए फाइनल में जो पढ़ा है ना लॉ में,
हाँ।
वो सब याद दिला दिया है सर ने।
बहुत बढ़िया, बहुत
यही पढ़ा था सब, मतलब इंटरप्रिटेशन, स्टिक इंटरप्रिटेशन।
ओके
और
ओके।
मेरा एकदम फेवरेट सब्जेक्ट था सर ये।
अरे वाह, गुड।
यस सर।
चलिए।
सर पवन बोल रहा था।
हाँ पवन जी बोलिए।
सर ये लिटिल इंटरप्रिटेशन और स्टेक इंटरप्रिटेशन जो भी डिस्कस किया था,
हाँ
इसमें सर अपन जो ये टेक्निकल एरर का बोलते हैं साइन मिसमैच है, तो इसमें तो ये फिर अपना लूज पॉइंट ही रहेगा ना फिर, क्योंकि अगर स्टेक इंटरप्रिटेशन करेंगे तो वही जजमेंट आएगा कि भाई लॉ मेकर का ही इंटेंशन था कि, तो इसका कोई
पवन जी अभी तो बस इतना बताइए इनका सेशन कैसा था, सवाल जवाब।
तो सर बहुत बढ़िया था सर।
हाँ बस इतना ही, बाद में करेंगे।
Very good session, sir. Very good session. Enjoyed it.
ओके अरविंद जी।
Great session. Fine.
ओके जितेंद्र जी।
सर अच्छा था।
सर बहुत अच्छा सेशन रहा सर।
ग्रेट सेशन।
और
सर महेश बोल रहा हूँ सर।
हाँ महेश जी बोलिए।
मैं लेट ज्वाइन कर पाया, बट जितना मैंने सुना सर को, एक्सीलेंट।
गुड।
मैं रविनारायण बोल रहा हूँ सर।
हाँ रविनारायण जी बोलिए।
वेरी गुड सेशन सर। वो क्लास याद दिला दिए सर, पुराने जो पढ़े थे।
तो देखिए आप लोग सेशन लेंगे तो कितना अच्छा होगा बताइए, नहीं?
यस सर।
यस सर यस।
आप लोग भी कोई टॉपिक तैयार कीजिए, उसका सेशन लीजिए। अभी हमने है ना एक तो इनको बुलाया है, कहाँ गए, प्रतीक